All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to take our definitions of income and substitution effects that we developed in the last video and try to figure out how to graphically disentangle these two effects. In other words, we're going to decompose our total effect, right, from O to F into an income effect and a substitution effect. So let's start by thinking about the substitution effect. What I want to know, right, if I want to find a substitution effect, is I want to know how much my consumption of food would have changed if the relative price of food and housing had changed, right? If food had gotten cheaper, but I hadn't gotten any richer. So to think about that, let's think about what it means to get richer, right? Again, we don't mean by this that you have more dollars in your pocket. We mean that your purchasing power, the value of your budget, is the same. So if we wanted to draw two budgets, right? A budget that was just as valuable as our original budget, what we would need to do is find a budget that has a best choice, an optimal choice, that's just as good but no better than choice O, right? In other words, we need to find a budget constraint that has an optimal choice that you're indifferent to point O. So where are we going to find a point that you're indifferent to point O? We're going to find it on your indifference curve, right? That's what the indifference curve does. Awesome. So we want to find a point on our indifference curve where we have the same relative prices on our original indifference curve, where the relative price of food and housing is the same as it is at our final point, right after the price changes. So what does it mean that the relative price is the same? It means that the slope of this new hypothetical budget constraint has to be the same as the slope of our final budget constraint, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to take our final budget constraint, right? Take that slope and shift the slope down until it touches our original indifference curve at just one point, right? In other words, what we're going to do is we're going to say, imagine if we had lowered the price of Lunchables, but then we'd taken dollars out of your pocket up until the point where you were no better off and no worse off than you were originally, right? Before we lowered the price and before we took dollars out of your pocket. And I'll call this point S for substitution. The crucial point here, right, is there's the same relative price change from O to S as there was from O to F, right? We still have price of food equal to 1 at our new hypothetical budget. So we're going to have the same income effect from O to S as we would from O to F. I'm sorry, the same substitution effect from O to S as we'd have from O to F. But there's no income effect because we're just as well off at point S as we are at point F. So the change from O to S O to S is our substitution effect. Right? And the reason this is our substitution effect from O to S is because at S, same relative price as F, same well-being as O. Does this make sense? So we can say that, right? This change is our substitution effect. Right? So it looks like the way I drew this, and of course I'm still drawing kind of at random, right? We would end up with something like 350 Lunchables if we changed the relative prices but then took away your income. So our substitution effect is going to be 350 minus our original point, right, minus 100, which is going to equal something like 250. Okay, great. So that's our substitution effect, right, O to S. So now how about our income effect? Remember, our goal, right, what we want to say when we calculate our income effect is, what's the effect of getting richer, right? We know that we're better off at F than we are at O. How does being better off affect our consumption of Lunchables? And what we really want, right, is how would getting better off, as much better off as we go from O to F, affect our consumption of Lunchables if there hadn't been any relative price change, right? If the price of Lunchables compared to the price of housing was the same at F and at O. So the way we can do that, right, is we can think about some point that is just as good as O, but has the same price ratio as F. And conveniently enough, we've already identified that point, right? That point is point S. So our income effect, right, is just going to be the change from S to F. And the reason, right, is this hypothetical budget constraint that I drew here, this red budget constraint, has the same slope as our final budget constraint, right? So there's no relative price change when we go to S, from S to F. All that happens is at F, we're richer than we are at S, right? And we know we're as much richer from S to F as we were from O to F, because O and S are just as good as each other, right? So we can say our income effect is going to be the change from S to F, right? Is our income effect, right? If we start at S, we're going to have same prices as F, different, right? Same prices as F, and same well-being as O. Right? So change from S to F is just change in well-being. Right? So then what's our income effect? Our income effect is going to be where we are when we're better off and have a different price, minus where we are when we have a different price but are no better. So I'm going to say, right, it's going to be 500 minus 350. Sorry, I'll color code this like I've done before. 500 minus 350, right, which is going to be 150. Right? So our total effect right, is going to be the substitution effect plus the income effect, which we knew ahead of time, right, was equal to 400. And what that's going to be, right, is going to be 250 plus 150 is 400. Right, so we're taking our total effect, which we knew before we did the decomposition, we're breaking it up into these two components, right, the change due to substitution, the change due to income, which has to add up to our total effect. Okay, so that's it, right, when it comes to decomposing the income and substitution effect of the change in price of Lunchables on our consumption of Lunchables. But what if we wanted to know the effect, what if we wanted to decompose the effect of this change in price on our consumption of housing? Well, we do the exact same thing, right? If we think about housing, our substitution effect is going to be the result of the fact that housing became relatively more expensive. And again, right, this is really important. The price of housing didn't change, right? Housing cost $2 a square foot before and $2 a square foot after. So the dollar price of housing didn't change at all, but the relative price of housing did change, right? A square foot of housing used to cost half a Lunchable, now it costs 2 Lunchables. So what's the substitution effect that results from that relative price increase? Well, again, right, it's just going to be how much I would have consumed in housing if I'd had that relative price increase, but I hadn't been made any better off, any happier because of my increased purchasing power, right? So again, this is going to just be the change from O to S, right? This is going to be our substitution effect with respect to housing, right? So our substitution effect for housing, let's call this 200. Again, just drawing pictures, right? It's still just going to be the change from O to S, right? So it's going to be 200 minus our original, which was 400, which is going to equal, right, negative 200. The relative price of housing went up. So if that's all that had happened, I would have bought 200 square feet less of housing. Okay. And how about the income effect on housing? Well, we got richer, right? We got an increase in purchasing power. If housing is a normal good, which the way that we drew this it is, right, an increase in purchasing power should result in us buying more housing, regardless of the fact that that increase in purchasing power came as a result of a change in the price of food, right? If we're shifting from S to F, all that's happening is we got richer, right? We got richer, and that's going to affect both of our goods based on whether those goods are normal or inferior goods, rather than which goods price changed. And again, right, our dollar price, our dollar incomes didn't change, our purchasing power changed, and that's what matters. So what's the income effect when it comes to our consumption of housing? Well, again, it's just going to be the change from S to F, right? So this change is going to be our income effect. And if we want to do it mathematically, right, it's going to be the amount of housing we consume at our final point, which is 350, right, minus the amount of housing that we consumed at our substitution point, which is 200. So what's that going to be? It's going to be positive 150, right? Getting richer caused us to buy 150 square feet more of housing than we would have if the relative price had changed, but we lost income until we were just as well off as we were at point O. And so our final effect, again, right, we knew the punchline at the end, right? We knew that our final effect had to be plus 50. And that's going to be the result of a negative 200 substitution effect and a positive 150 income effect. Okay, does this make sense? Great. If not, please let me know when we talk about this in person. Okay, so I want to leave you with a few final words about income and substitution effects that we can glean from this diagram, from this graph. So when we're thinking about substitution effects, right, we know that point S is always going to be on the same indifference curve as our original point O. Same indifference curve as point O, right? But it's going to have a different slope, right? So the point is going to be, we're going to draw this hypothetical budget, right, which we're just making up to decompose these two effects, so that you're just as happy at point S as you are at point O, right? Does this make sense? Now, with one exception, which is perfect complements, and we'll talk about that later, right? Points S and point O are not going to be the same point, right? And point O is not going to be affordable on our new budget constraint point S. And this, by the way, is what you showed in your second problem set, the first question in your second problem set, right? If we drew our new budget constraint so that point O is affordable, right? We had a compensated price change. That would make you happier because you could end up choosing more Lunchables and less housing and be better off, right? So O will not be affordable. At hypothetical budget constraint. And then the last thing that I want to point out is that when we are looking at substitution effects, it's unambiguously the case that we're going to end up consuming more of what got cheaper and less of what got relatively expensive, unless the goods are perfect complements, in which case we'll consume the same that we did before. But we'll never consume more of the good that got relatively expensive. So substitution effects always increase or leave the same good that got relatively cheaper. And if we want to understand why this is, right, if we just draw a generic indifference curve, right, when we have an indifference curve that's at all curvy, we're going to have a higher MRS by going up into the right, up into the left, and a lower MRS by going down into the right. Right, this comes about as a result of our preferences being well behaved, right, as a result of the fact that we prefer averages to extremes. So if we start with a price like this, and then we make the slopes less steep, we're always going to have to find, if we're on the same indifference curve, the less steep slope in the direction of more of the horizontal good and less of the vertical good. Right? And of course, in the other direction, right, when we make this slope steeper, we're always going to find our optimal point in the direction where we have more of the vertical good and less of the horizontal good. Now, it turns out, you don't have to worry about this too much, but I'm happy to talk to you about it if you're interested. It turns out that this is true even when we have indifference curves that aren't well behaved. So the obvious example is perfect substitutes, right, where they're just straight lines. But even if they curved in the wrong direction, we would still find that substitution effects can never cause us to consume more of the good that got more expensive, got relatively more expensive. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about substitution effects. Let's take a minute to talk about income effects. So the first important point, right, is that our hypothetical budget constraint has the same slope as our new budget constraint. Right? That's how we're going to identify our income effects. Now, the direction of the income effects are going to depend on two things. Right? The first is whether we got richer or poorer. The second is whether goods are inferior or normal goods. So if we have a price decrease, right, that means that we got richer. And if we get richer, we're going to buy more normal goods and fewer inferior goods. Right? On the other hand, if we have prices increase, then we got poorer. Right? And if we get poorer, we're going to buy fewer normal goods and more inferior goods. And the last thing that I want to point out, which is pretty important to remember, is that when we're figuring out how we're going to respond to a price change in terms of the income effect, it doesn't matter which prices went up or which prices went down, right? A decrease in the price of food made us feel richer, and that's going to affect us when we're choosing housing. The income effect is going to be the same as if we felt just as much richer because of a change in the price of housing. So it doesn't matter which price changed. Right? All that matters is how much richer or how much poorer we're going to feel. Okay, awesome. Okay, so thanks for sticking with me. This is what I'm going to say about how to decompose income and substitution effects. In the next video, we're going to talk about why income and substitution effects might be larger and why they might be smaller. In other words, we're going to be able to connect assumptions we make about people's preferences to the size of these two effects so that we can more accurately predict how a change in prices or another change in budget constraints affects people's choices.